Reacting to NFL Week 1, our thoughts on what it means for the rest of the season, and much more. That's what we're going to talk about here on RotoViz Overtime today. We are recording this one on the 9th of September, one day after Sunday's action has completed. Shawn and Ben, just a shout out at the start of the show, had a fantastic episode of Stealing Bananas. They did post it live on Stealing Signal's YouTube channel, but it is up on the Stealing Bananas podcast playing feeds. I would recommend to check that out as well after you have a listen through this. But Shawn, I'm mentioning this at the start in case I forget. I've forgotten some podcasts. I've mentioned at the end of some drafts a baby due in the Kelly household this week, maybe as soon as the next 24 hours. So if I seem like I'm on a different planet here at times during this podcast recording, people will know why. But as I told Shawn, quite excited. And I've kind of held it under wraps the entire time, but it's pretty close now, Shawn. Pretty exciting. Made for a different NFL watching experience, but it's going to be a big change here in the house. But looking forward to a new member of the RotoViz OT community coming up here, Shawn.
We're so excited for you, and it's a great development, I think, as it comes around week 1, because it's a fantastic reminder that this is for fun, and there are a lot more important things than fantasy football when you're getting to watch the games with kind of that perspective. You can sit back, you can relax, you can enjoy. Just so exciting. And congratulations from the entire Overtime community. Again, just so cool. Colm, maybe your Packers knew that you had other things in your life to keep you on cloud 9 this week, because that game didn't go quite the way we were hoping. Obviously, the Friday night game is a few more days removed now, and we've had this big Sunday slate. So many things to discuss there, but as Chiefs fans, as Packers fans, one of us got very fortunate at the end of Thursday Night Football. The other one both lost, and then a game that they controlled and should have won. And then also you get this potential Jordan Love dagger. What were you thinking for the Packers, and also for some of these teams that we've built together, that we've built individually, where Jordan Love is an important piece, but then you have the ultra high highs of feeling like the Jayden Reed play is not just going to win, but potentially have him be among the top 2 or 3 best picks in all of fantasy. Now, again, that's within the context of individual players are going to go off throughout the season. You're going to have one-off big games. It often feels larger than it actually is when it happens in week 1. But when you see all of the parts of the thesis come to fruition in such a major way, so dynamically, right off the bat, and you have those points, and then it's set to have that happen occasionally in the future, even though, obviously he's not going to average anywhere close to 33 points a game, but it was a real roller coaster when you think through what happened with Reed, what happened with the Packers blowing some opportunities, and then the specter of losing Jordan Love for the season, which now hopefully could be limited to as little as 3 games.
Yeah, so it was a wide range of emotions, and because, sometimes you have these games where player gets hurt early in the game or halfway through. For example, on Sunday, watching the games as they're happening, and, Jalen Waddle's getting checked for concussion, and you're like, well, that's a real bummer. But he comes back in. So it could have been a case he had concussion, missed the rest of the game. We see players go out and not come back. But it's kind of strange when you have a game where you're like, your focus is on, like, we should have won this game. This went well. This didn't go good. And then all of a sudden, like, one play from the end of the game, you're like, well, the star quarterback that we're after giving all to may have just ended up, getting lost for the entire season. So there's a wide range of emotions that happened at the end of that game that changed how you felt about it during the game. Thankfully, since that time, everything is, in a good place. Not a good place, but a much better place than it looked for Jordan Love and his rest of season. The tricky part for that is what the Packers do over those coming weeks where he's not there. That is obviously something for the team to decide whether they bring somebody in. I'm not overly confident in Malik Willis, if that's the way that they go with it in terms of what that means then, I guess, as we move on to the team itself. Jayden Reed, I think some of these players are, and Jayden Reed might be one of those where you can use him in a multitude of ways. The trouble is that we see him, have a kind of a Xavier-worthy highlight rushing touchdown in this one for 33 yards, which is obviously an awesome play to see. But we get him then for 138 yards, but on the 4 receptions, one of those being a 70-yard reception. Those deeper shots and those deeper completions become more challenging with different quarterbacks. And we've seen that throughout the NFL this weekend, that some of the teams, either schematically or quarterback driven, really struggle to move the ball. I think the Packers have shown that the scheme works, but the scheme works with Jordan Love as the quarterback. And if you dip down below that level, a lot of those things that we've seen at the start of last season where the timing and that wasn't there, we could really get back into that similar situation. So there is some concern as to how that plays out. I feel like the Packers are probably going to try and go with Malik Willis for certainly week 2 here. So there is some concerns as to how that balances out. For the overall team, though, outside of the Love part moving forward, I think Reed looked amazing. Like you touched a bit there, he goes from like being a good pick to being like the absolute league crushing player. Looked absolutely fantastic in this. The other part, though, Shawn, that I thought was kind of interesting from the Packers' perspective was how the tight ends were used. And we talked about this on shows, and myself and yourself had disagreements at times as to which direction it should go. But Tucker Kraft certainly had the better game, although it wasn't anything to write home about. 2 for 37 on 3 targets, but 0 receptions for Luke Musgrave. So I think that's not in the same way as we're seeing with the Ravens conversation with Likely and Andrews, but I think there's some dynamics that'll play into a 1-week sample size between that as well. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the tight ends moving forward, and if you think this is already like a complete shift between the two of those. The other side of this game was the Packers defense really was very poor in this one, and that led to situations where Barkley was gashing them. He ends up with 109 yards and 2 touchdowns. Obviously somebody that at his cost was not on my draft board. The other player, AJ Brown, 5 for 119 on 10 targets and a touchdown for him. But again, some blowing coverages in there. If I look at the Packers side of things, Shawn, the part I was so disappointed in this, and it was a theme for me for the entire weekend in the NFL, was teams not going for it on 4th down. So like getting into the opponent's territory, whether it's, within the red zone or at the edge of 30 to 20 yards, and you're at 4th and 4, for example, and you're kicking field goals. And the Packers had 2 turnovers off the Eagles. I mentioned the Packers defense playing pretty poor, but they started off with 2 turnovers off the Eagles, but they turned it into 6 points. We've seen that around the NFL this weekend, where teams settle time and time again for field goals. Like even in some of these games, it may have been the Steelers game where I think that the Steelers kicker either had 4 or 5 kicks from 50 plus yards. Like teams were just like, right, we're at halfway, let's just settle for a field goal here. And I thought that happened a lot around the league in general. And I don't know if that's just week 1 and maybe teams not being overly confident or maybe being conservative, but I think in those situations you really have to try and take advantage of the territory that you've gained. The other part in this with the Packers was, they have an early touchdown to Reed that gets wiped off the board. There was some big plays that could have changed the trajectory of this game. I think this is one they left on the board, but how things played out and how the injury news with Jordan Love played out, I think, the loss was almost not that consequential versus what could have happened with Love's entire season. So I think there's a lot of positives to be had. If Love hadn't got hurt, I would have been extremely excited about some of these prospects. Wicks was the other one where the timing was just not there at all. 3 targets, no receptions, and they were all pretty much in that kind of catchable area for him. But the tight end, Shawn, was my thoughts for you. Do you see that as still a split like I thought it was potentially going to be, or do you think that Tucker Kraft is there to take over?
When you read the tea leaves and you know that Kraft missed a bunch of practice time and yet was still in many ways the featured player, it does seem like he's going to be the guy. Now, it's this interesting dynamic because you look back to where they were at the beginning of last season, And Kraft came in with a better production profile than Musgrave. And yet Musgrave had been the earlier pick. He's the more athletic player. And you also got this spin that maybe he was more ready, which is interesting, again, with the lack of production that he was bringing with him. Tight end is a position not necessarily unlike others. I mean, athleticism matters a ton when you're talking about professional sports. It would be ludicrous to say that it doesn't. We can't all go out and do this. You can't simply work on your craft or work on your toughness and be a professional athlete. But within that group of athletes where they're close enough, production is still very, very meaningful, even for some of these positions like tight end, like running back, where it has historically been a bigger element of projection than it is for wide receiver, for example. But to get Kraft making the progress during the season last year, and then to be someone who was more capable of, I mean, one of the things, you go back and look at the numbers, they're not necessarily that dissimilar, but you watch the games and Kraft seemed like a much bigger part of the offense during the time period where he was out there as opposed to when Musgrave was. Obviously, the fact that he is out there because the starter is injured, and the starter, again, drafted earlier, more athletic, you think that's going to revert going into the new season, especially when this injury that kept Kraft from being able to practice is something where you're thinking he's not going to be able to overtake or demonstrate that he's definitively better. Even with all of those things being the case, we now have additional information that the Packers see him as being at least similar, if not better. And if they're both out there and Kraft is better, which is kind of the direction that I would take this, then I think you're going to see a lot of what we saw in week one, which is that he plays more, he scores better. My concern, I think, would be for the tight ends is if they both play, then that ends up cannibalizing in the same way that the non-read receivers are probably going to cannibalize. Not that there aren't going to be weeks that they're very startable. If you have Tucker Kraft in best ball, because of the price and the fact that you don't have to decide when to start him, I think that's going to end up being a very good pick. I'm a little skeptical that any of the non-read receiving threats are going to help you very much in redraft, because they are going to score, and yet you could have this dynamic where you kind of go back and forth. You put them in, they don't score. You're like, I can't afford the inconsistency. You bench them, they score. Now, you could end up playing it right and get lucky, or they could end up emerging. I mean, Christian Watson is maybe not that far off from still having a big game. Wicks was more involved than I expected. And so the fact that they, missed some of those connections, you could look at that as an opportunity to, in very deep redraft leagues, to stash him again once he's dropped. I mean, people are still fairly high on him.
The trouble with all of that is now that Love isn't there, it becomes very hard to even stash them for 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the starting quarterbacks this weekend played poorly enough. Even the name guys that it reminds you how difficult it can be. Calvin Ridley wide open for a number of long touchdowns in week one. Someone who, if you had a viable starting quarterback, people would be buzzing about today because the score was so big. And instead, it's more a thing where if you drafted Calvin Ridley, you're really scared right now, because even in a game where he got open for a couple of deep touchdowns, which just generally isn't going to happen, it's a tough thing to do even for the good receivers. Even in that instance, he didn't give you a viable fantasy score.
He didn't. And the part, Shawn, I was going to kind of translate it into was the QB struggles for the week. And it's kind of one of those, like when we're looking at some of these teams, it can be the team struggles. Maybe we see teams kind of skip the preseason. We've seen the Bengals, like, you mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but like yet again, they are not ready for week one. Now, part of that is Jamar Chase didn't, train the majority of the offseason with the team, or they have different dynamics at play like that. Then T. Higgins is out. There's lots of things happening, but there's some of these teams that maybe playing in the preseason may have given them the advantage then for week one. We kind of do see season on season where some teams have like really prepared well for week one solely, and like they have a big win in week one, and then the rest of the season maybe is a different picture, and vice versa. I think it was one of the Aaron Rodgers MVP seasons where they got absolutely blown out by the Saints in week one, and the offense just looked, desperate. And then like he goes on to have one of his MVP seasons. We do see things turn around, but not every team will turn around. Some of these teams, what we've seen this week is what they're going to be. Other teams, it will be, 2 weeks down the line, and we're saying that week one was just a once-off in terms of the overall season sample size and looking ahead. But you're talking about the Titans and that game in particular. I know the Bears come out with a win, but I thought Caleb Williams struggled quite significantly in that game. We have Will Levis, who was 19-32. He had 127 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, 3 sacks for 23 yards. Williams did have a couple of rookie errors. One of them was a really deep sack, so he had two sacks for 29 yards, but he goes 14-29 for 93 yards in that. There was a lot of struggles running the ball, a lot of struggles then obviously in the receiving game for both teams. But that's in two offenses where the receiving game is pretty much tanked. There's a combined like 200 and less than 220 yards combined, receiving yards. And that one, you have the Saints game then where Bryce Young looks kind of like he looked last year and was all out of sorts again. He's 13 of 30 for 161, 2 interceptions, 4 sacks for 26 yards. And Daniel Jones, Shawn, maybe this was down to the New York Giants having the maybe the ugliest uniforms I've ever seen in the NFL. They're like for people who are familiar with like rugby, they're like a rugby style shirt, but they are sore on your eyes trying to watch the game. But the Giants were also sore on your eyes trying to watch that performance. He's 22 of 41 for 186 yards, 2 touchdowns, 5 sacks for 20 yards. And that's only a couple of teams that there was more and more cases of this. Do you think this is a case where like week one teams aren't ready, or do you think we're going to see more of the same from kind of those offenses that I mentioned, that there's going to be like, real struggles for the teams who either with scheme issues or talent issues, that we're going to continue to see that for the rest of the season? Or do you think that, like, I think some of the stuff this week is just teams not being ready for week one and then facing teams who maybe either have more talent and can kind of get over those issues, or just teams that are more prepared and they just get like absolutely hit in the mouth. Like that Panthers game, like a team as bad as the Panthers performed this week should not be playing in the NFL. Like that's how bad they were. And I don't think you've seen that game in full yet, but like shambolic, like defensively, and like the offense was terrible. The defense was worse.
You mentioned the Packers from a few years ago. Ben mentioned that on Stealing Bananas. We get a lot of instances of that, but even when you have a lot of those examples, what you mostly have, there was a game for the Patriots maybe almost 2 decades ago now. Time flies.
I believe it was the Thursday night football game where the Chiefs hammered the Patriots. That was the we're on to Cincinnati game, I think, for Belichick, and I think the Patriots won the Super Bowl that season.
I was thinking it was a game.
That was the Kareem Hunt game, if I'm remembering correctly, that he kind of came out.
Colm, in 2003, the New England Patriots went out in week 1, lost to the Buffalo Bills 31-0, and then went 14-2 and won the Super Bowl. From that point on, they lost one more game and they completely and totally dominated their opponents. So there's a one-off element to week 1, even much more than any other week, to where you have to maintain a lot of skepticism about it, where at the same time you have to be willing to incorporate what you saw, which is that a lot of the teams are not ready. A lot of the game plans don't work. And there's a big difference between Aaron Rodgers having a bad week 1 or Bill Belichick having a bad week 1 and teams who are sort of undermanned, who have a lot of inexperience in the coaching staff, who are weak top to bottom in the roster, who don't have an experienced quarterback. All of those types of things, if you come out in week 1 and get hammered, you can still grow, and you should grow, but it's problematic. At the same time, teams where you would have expected there to be struggles, I think you would expect the Chicago Bears to not look like they're eventually going to look in week 1. You would have expected the Denver Broncos to not look the way they're going to eventually look in week 1. You would have expected the Commanders. Basically, I think you would have expected exactly what the Commanders did, which is that Jayden Reed was going to run for a lot of yards. He was going to potentially score a rushing touchdown or 2, and otherwise they were going to look like one of the 3 or 4 worst teams in football, which is what happened. The passing game was awful. The defense was tragically bad. I mean, Mike Evans is good. Chris Godwin is good. Baker Mayfield is a legit NFL starter. You probably wouldn't put him higher than that, but he is a legitimate NFL starter. You shouldn't look like you're playing against a high school JV team, right?
That's true, but I also think that the Commanders' defense is maybe levels ahead of the Panthers. That's how bad the Panthers' defense were.
Again, I haven't seen that one. I would be pretty shocked if the Commanders' defense doesn't end up being the worst defense.
It's going to be really, really bad. It's going to be down at the bottom. But Shawn, you're mentioning, some of the players, like we're talking about Hall of Fame, legendary quarterbacks or coordinators having those situations. But, looking back to this time last year, there was obviously some positives around it, but we did get the Texans losing to the Ravens. The Ravens were obviously a team that would have been thought of as a contender at that point, but CJ Stroud went 28 for 44 for 242, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 5 sacks for 46 yards. That's not a terrible stat line, but there is situations where like then 3 weeks later we're like, this guy is just like the next level. Like we haven't seen this from a rookie quarterback in such a long time. And I'm not necessarily talking about Daniel Jones here, but some of the rookie QB struggles over the weekend, I think, again, some of them could turn out to be Bryce Young, but there is potential for some of them to have like the growth as the season goes on, and kind of they're seeing stuff in week 1 of the NFL season that they're not seeing in the preseason, where like those complete vanilla defenses in the preseason are now like trying to push you into difficult decisions. And one of the things, for example, the Seahawks did a lot against Bo Nix in this particular contest was they went into zone coverage a lot versus they barely played any man. So it was a case that they were making Nix make the decisions. And then there was certain times where like he's, throwing the ball, if it's beyond the line of scrimmage, and next thing there's 3 men in that zone, he's kind of trying to read where his man is going rather than where that zone is set up. And I think that's something that only can come with, getting those live reps and seeing what it looks like then on tape over the course of the coming weeks. But it might be something that he never gets. But when you're talking about the week 1 part as well, the other part that's tricky to balance is we've spent pretty much like 7 to 8 months kind of thinking this is what we think this season's going to go like. This is what week 1 is going to be. This is how it's going to play out. You kind of have that idea in your mind for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But then it gets to week 1 and it's like, well, this thing didn't go exactly like I thought it was going to go. So like the world is falling down around me. There's like trying to find the balance between how far off we were and the kind of analysis of how the things would play out, and then how it actually is going to play out over the course of the sample size. Because the thoughts that we had, a month ago about how the season would play out, they weren't based on a 1-week sample size in week 1. They're based on, 17-week fantasy football season or the entire NFL season. And there is obviously reacting to that and being like, well, this has changed so dramatically. Like one of the things I was probably most surprised by out of the entire weekend, Shawn, was when the Packers played the Eagles and Saquon Barkley was getting carries inside the 5-yard line. Like DeAndre Swift didn't have a big performance this week, but I'm sure that when he's seen that game, he's thinking, like, what happened from last year? Like, where were these carries last year? So there's some things that can change that maybe you don't see coming, but there's a lot of stuff then that can change, back to kind of the like closer to what the predicted outcome was when we get into week 2?
I guess for me, the Swift deal, even as someone who has previously been enthusiastic, is mostly that he's just not good at all. He looked awful for the Bears, and there was a big
there's a big change off, and like, you know, even from where he was with the Lions and how he performed last season. I'm more talking about like Jalen Hurts and the tush push, just like automatic every time inside the 5-yard line, to like, we don't have, you know, Kelsey anymore, so we're just going to hand it off to Saquon Barkley every time we get down here.
But that's not really what happened, though. I mean, they ran the sneaks with some success. They had a fluky fumble. I mean, the thing I think you're concerned about, if you don't have exposure to Barkley, is mostly just that he looked good. But the other issue is that fluky plays are going to catch the attention of coaches because we're humans. And so you have that negative play there where they fumble the ball, and suddenly you're thinking, well, maybe it actually is safer to hand the ball off to this 230-pound running back. The thing that's interesting there is that Barkley has been a go down on contact kind of back, and he looked more powerful in this game than he's looked for a long, long time. It's actually not his game, right? And he's a breakaway runner, and he did have a breakaway run. And that's the thing I think you're going to see more in the future than, you know, them getting him a bunch of short scores, for example. But with the veterans, we generally know who the guys are. The context is going to matter some. One of the things that I'm writing up right now for the Monday article, you know, talks about the Texans-Colts game and Joe Mixon versus Jonathan Taylor, and how Mixon looked like he was running against a flag football defense or was participating in a non-padded practice where Taylor didn't have running lanes. And then you go and look at the strength of schedule streamer, and you see that it has Mixon as one of the top matchups of the week and Taylor as one of the bottom matchups of the week. And it's a reminder, not that you didn't already know that, but it's a reminder that teams are facing different caliber of defenses, and the teams believe they have different incentives.
You made that point in Stealing Bananas when you were talking about, you know, basically, you know, playing against the Panthers defense or playing against the Washington Commanders defense versus playing against the Steelers defense, like the Falcons had to this week. And the Falcons had a number of other issues this week in terms of like just play design and play call, and whether Kirk Cousins is actually, you know, fully recovered from his, you know, injury, and how he can move about and, you know, run that offense in general. But there's like some of these, like the Cowboys defense, for example, like the Browns offense is going, in my opinion, going to be pretty bleak at times this season, like it was this week. But there is also the fact that they played against the Cowboys defense, which I don't think is going to be fun for anyone to face this year. So there's kind of those balances.
Well, your Packers lit them up. The Cowboys, I think, are a defense. I mean, this isn't no way casting aspersions the way that it seems like, but they're the type of defense where if you don't match up with them very well, then they're going to humiliate you. But if you do match up with them,
the teams, they really can bully the teams that don't match up with them well. But if you have somebody who's going to put the ball in certain situations, they're going to get caught out. They have players who really are aggressive on the back end, who want to get interceptions and pick sixes. The tricky part with that is that if you can, you know, make them try and bite on plays, you can absolutely destroy them. That's easier said than done, I do think.
From a reality perspective, it becomes a little bit useless if your defense is only good against bad teams. Those aren't the teams you need to beat to accomplish your objectives. From a fantasy perspective, it's kind of fun because they're very playable in fantasy themselves, and then they create these unique game environments where, you know, you get a lot of garbage time like we did with the Browns, or if they are exploitable because you are good enough like the Packers were last year in the playoffs, then you can put some serious points on them. And then that part washes back onto their own offense where they put up some serious numbers. All of those things are kind of interesting. But I do think that, you know, kind of the fundamental point is that we have a lot of information about the veterans. Now, players who have changed teams, and certainly running backs, every year is a new dynamic, right? Is a new season from the perspective of the running backs fall off the cliff so hard and fast that there is reason for terror there if you are rostering them. Even someone that we've talked quite a bit about, like a James Conner, who had fantastic peripherals last year. You still have a lot of risk with him in the same way or in a different way, but not eliminated from a risk perspective that you have with the guys who had terrible peripherals like last year, like a Mixon, like an Elliott, like a Kamara, like a Barkley. So many of the backs who fit that kind of veteran, aging, poor recent performance are now in different circumstances, either on different teams or Kamara, for example, with a different coordinator. And then when you get a lot of these guys in very, very favorable matchups in week one, even though we think that we know who the veterans are, then there's that question in the back of your mind, well, maybe we're not right about even the veterans. Maybe they'll be able to do these things, especially if the team is going to lean into them from a usage perspective. Colm, I always kind of take this back to the idea of it's very fortunate that we get these performances in week one and week two and week three. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a running back dead zone, right? All you would have are the good backs being selected early, and then even starters with meaningful week one, week two workloads would be drafted even in that 10, 11, 12 range. Now, some people are saying, well, look, Gus Edwards and Ezekiel Elliott were drafted in that range. Two very different outcomes for them. I mean, one of the things that we have to always continue to process and to be open to is this idea that you can have a Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins situation where the guy who in some ways is more fragile or is not the one the team has advertised blows up. And in the same or a very similar situation on a different team, you can have the opposite happen. But the other thing that we want to keep in mind there is that we might see something different in week two, different in week three, different in week four. It is interesting in this context where it wasn't just a usage thing, but the backups for the Chargers and the Cowboys had very different performances in terms of kind of who they are or who they might be, right? And what the coaches might think about who they are, and then what that means going forward. I mean, that's kind of a situation where very superficially, we appear to have gotten both of those mildly right, but I would be skeptical that we have nearly enough information to think that's going to hold up in week two or week three, much less week 9, week 10, week 11. And we could be sitting here 2 weeks from now with Rico Dowdle having scored 45 points, with Gus Edwards having scored 3 goal line touchdowns, and J.K. Dobbins not breaking some big plays and just looking done. And then your question is, where are we with Kamani Vidal? Where are we with Dalvin Cook? I mean, if Rico Dowdle goes out and has a 150-yard, 3-touchdown game, where you are with Dalvin Cook is that he's probably not going to play, right? There's going to continue to be evolution with all of the teams. It's definitely evolution with these teams that have 2 enigmatic like co-starters, and then maybe a more difficult to read, a complete black box third string guy. We know those situations are going to be tough to read. The thing that we want to keep in the front of the mind is that even some of the apparently clear-cut situations are also going to be difficult to read. James Conner looked very good, but Trey Benson got a series in the Cardinals game, and the Cardinals in the second half of that game really melted down offensively. What does the coaching staff decide to do to make sure they don't have another game like this where you should win easily and you end up losing the contest? You have a situation where Kenneth Walker looked like potentially the best back in the NFL, but we got a reminder that Zach Charbonnet has those really soft hands, is a good high-value touch type of back where you have the goal line possibilities because he's a big downhill runner and you have that receiving viability. Now, he scores basically on a broken coverage, but again, those you don't take those touchdowns off the board. The fact that Kyle Pitts ran out and no defenders went with him, and he scores a touchdown after begging for the target when Kirk Cousins is not seeing him, it still counts. It's still something where the coaching staff is like, we got this guy open in the end zone. We should look at doing that again. we know that these plays are not necessarily predictive of a future play of the exact same kind, but coaches are going to go back to the well when they've managed to get some guys involved. So you could have that open. I mean, Kyron Williams, I don't know if you could say he looked very good. He's another player who had a very difficult matchup according to the strength of schedule streamer. Now, there are different things that go into that. It's not entirely the caliber of the rushing defense. It also considers what is the game likely to be like environmentally, right? Is the opponent going to be in a situation where they can run a lot? But you look at him, he scores a touchdown. The backups are not very involved. That doesn't mean that Blake Corum won't be involved in a month. And you want to keep that in mind, not only about the things that you feel like you were right about in week one, or so we tend to think about week one and you're like, okay, well, these are the things I was wrong. How do I make the process better? How do I rectify that in terms of
it's the biggest week for that though,
2 through 4, but also
when you're in week 7. When you're in week 7, you're not going to be saying I was wrong about week 7. Week 1 is the most focus on like what was right or what was wrong.
Right. So we want to think about if there were flaws in the process and how you would adjust to it both immediately and in the deep future. But you also want to think about things that you think you were right about. There's more of a trap of taking week 1 and saying, okay, I got this right and this right and this right. I'm so good at this, or whatever it happens to be, whatever your internal discussion is, and not consider that the running backs that you wanted to have a big workload and did are in many cases in the exact same situation as the backs where you didn't want to have a big workload, but they did. And you're telling yourself, well, that doesn't matter. In 2 or 3 weeks, the backup will actually create some real problems. You want to think about that for the players you think you were right about too. The other players on their team could create future problems in a way that you're not giving them credit for right now. The main thing here, and what we want to continue to be aware of all the time, is that there is chaos and the season evolves not just from a really long-term perspective, but week to week to week. And fantasy football is a weekly contest. That's one of the reasons why redraft is so fun. It's one of the reasons why home leagues are what we always come back to as being the things that you want to win. And Colm, speaking of weekly contests, as we finish up here, the Guillotine League, you and I look like we will both avoid the chop. I had a lot of fun with our draft and went ahead and selected sort of my favorite receivers, regardless of price, in a 17-team draft. I didn't want them going to someone else, regardless of what ADP said. Selected Devontae Smith, Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, and Jordan Addison. Watching those guys play this week was very, very fun. It sounds like Addison's ankle injury is not serious. That's a huge part of the Minnesota Vikings offense. They don't have enough talent outside of Justin. I mean, Justin Jefferson managers need to be rooting really hard for Jordan Addison. You need him to keep the defense honest so that Jefferson is not facing triple teams, quadruple teams, entire defense teams. I mean, it's potentially brutal for him if you don't have anybody else out there, because Sam Darnold is the guy that you have to manage and scheme guys open and hope he makes the throws. He is not going to elevate your receivers.
So Shawn might have touched on the thing. I was going to do like a rapid fire here of 3 other things to note from week 1. But Shawn, you did mention Jameson Williams. So he was one of the things that I was going to highlight and like ask you to focus on one. But I did think that Sunday Night Football was one of the more entertaining games of the week. Goes to overtime. The Lions win it late. We do see Jameson Williams with 9 targets, leading the team in targets in this one, along with 52. He has the 5 for 121 and a touchdown. Really positive to see him used in different facets of the overall offense and how he's used, and also to see him get 9 targets, I thought was really awesome. That may be just down to the Lions thought there was something schematically that they could work him in a little bit more. We'll see again. Maybe, don't mark him down for 9 targets every week, but it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Cooper Kupp, obviously, with Puka Nacua getting hurt in this one, has 21 targets, Shawn, 14 for 110 and a touchdown for him, looking pretty much like he looks when he's healthy. The other ones that I wanted to mention was Kyler Murray, and I have felt this way for a while. We've talked about it for a while. I just am not convinced at all in any way by Kyler Murray as a passer. He goes 21 of 31 in this one, 161 and a touchdown. Real struggles offensively through the air for the Cardinals in this one. There's times where, like, when you're watching it, you can see certain players wide open. I don't know if it's he can't see past the offensive line or whether his read is going slightly different, but there's a lot of plays I feel being left out there. But the other one, Shawn, that I wanted to mention to you was J.K. Dobbins. And you're in a situation where, we're hoping that he's healthy. We're hoping that things look right. He is not at the top speed J.K. Dobbins that we would have seen as he came out of college, but 10 for 135, a touchdown with a long of 61. And I was joking with you before we started recording, if he can get that 61-yard rush from the 50-yard line, we're looking at an amazing 50-yard touchdown. But the gas just wasn't there. Maybe the key is there's two ways this can go if you're looking at what happens the rest of the season. The body could break down as we get to week 5. Maybe he's just building up that engine, Shawn, and by week 5 he's uncatchable. But those 3 players, you can talk about them all if you want, but which of those got you most excited to finish on a... Well, obviously the Kyler Murray one didn't get you excited. You can skip that one if you want. Which got you most excited for week 1?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern for these Lions skill players because the person who is most involved in this game is their least talented player. David Montgomery got 17 carries.
Yeah.
You need to take all 17 of those plays out of the playbook and distribute them among Gibbs and Williams and Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown. They're not going to do that. So you need extreme play volume to get where you want to go. Now, the overtime drive does skew it a little bit. And as I mentioned on Ceiling Bananas, I think that part is arguably a little bit more justified, but partly it's only justified in retrospect because you know that it worked. This is a game where Montgomery and Gibbs combine for 28 rushing attempts and Goff throws 28 passes. There were a number of games like this, including the Houston Texans game, where for the teams to get where we want them to be, it just can't be that balanced. We can't enter into a 2024 environment where the elite passing offenses just say, okay, well, they're going to try and take some of this stuff away, so we won't do it. Now, Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to have this as his worst game of the season. And Jameson Williams is going to have it as his best game of the season, probably. So, I mean, those are things that we know. And it's with the Lions, it's kind of easy to look at it and say, okay, well, we know that this isn't going to work this way. And yet at the same time, it's still a problem because the reason that you and I and a lot of the RotoViz listeners and subscribers didn't draft a lot of Amon-Ra and didn't draft a lot of Laporta is that this type of game was in the works. So the reason that you load up on Jameson Williams is precisely because of the history where he was a fantastic college player, a first-round pick, and someone who the team has been raving about. You take that and you take the price, which is knocked down significantly for very justifiable reasons. And you say, with that profile at the price, I want someone who doesn't need as many touches to create the big games. And I realize that I'm taking on some risk from an individual game perspective because of the lack of volume. But this is one of those elements where I think it's easy to not think about it correctly or not think about it correctly within the context of price, where what we really would love is to have players that have the dynamism to create big plays and they're incredibly involved in the offense. And that's where you get first round picks. But as you kind of move out of that group, I think that the constant emphasis on usage keeps people from stacking their rosters with the right types of players, maybe especially in redraft. And one of the reasons that we wanted Worthy and Reed and Williams was because all 3 of those guys have this profile where you can't really stop them from being involved because they're simply too electric. They're too fast. So if the team is going to have some plays drawn up for them, there's the likelihood that those plays come off in a way that has potential. What these three guys did in week one is not going to happen again. Xavier Worthy is not going to have multiple touchdowns on just a few touches. And maybe he will. He's that good, but it's not very likely. And Jayden Reed is not going to have a rushing touchdown and a 70-yard receiving touchdown very often. That just doesn't happen. Jameson Williams is not going to do what he did very often. And yet you're going to have these spike weeks, but you're also going to have a lot of just simply decent games because the players are so good both before and after the actual touch of the ball, and because when teams see them do this. And one of the reasons to be excited about these three players is that, again, because of psychology, the team is going to say, this worked. We have to make sure we keep doing it. And even though you don't get those big plays every week, you might get a little bit more usage even. Now, I don't think you're going to get more usage for Williams than what he had, but you can keep it at a little bit higher level than was anticipated. This type of usage was not anticipated for Williams. I think he's not going to hit that, but he's going to be closer to it than what our preseason expectations were. Jayden Reed, again, closer to it. And then Xavier Worthy is someone who's going to build into more and more usage as the season goes along. So in all three of those cases, even though they may have had one of, if not their best games of the year, the floor continues to rise for them at the same time that the ceiling, because of the speed and the talent, every week is just very, very high.
So that is some of our week one thoughts. As I mentioned at the start, Shawn and Ben have done the stream over on the Stealing Signals YouTube channel. It is also going to be up on the Stealing Bananas podcast feed as 2 episodes. One of those coming out on Monday already, one of them coming out on Tuesday. So if you're listening to this, you'll be able to hear both of them at whatever time you listen to this. Obviously, one may not be available straight away, but I would highly recommend checking them out. Really good conversation between Shawn and Ben. That is going to do it for this edition of the RotoViz OT podcast. Myself and Shawn are going to record another show after this that will be kind of some evergreen content to come out on Wednesday, with the fact that I'm hoping that I will be preoccupied elsewhere in that moment, but it should be a fun conversation around some strategy to build your rosters for the rest of the season. So do subscribe and get that once it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. He did tease the Monday piece, which will be coming out obviously on Monday. You can check that out over there. And until we are back, have a good one.